Comcast a couple weeks ago, as most of you probably heard, announced their On Addressability initiative at the Cannes Lion conference. And at that same conference, David Klein, who's the EVP of Charter Spectrum, full disclosure, one of our board members, was quoted as saying, "Advertisers want to use television as a full funnel solution that marries the best of traditional television with increased data-driven capabilities for targeting and measurement." And then just last week, NCC announced that they're rebranding itself to Ampersand, which, as they say, is to reflect the company's mission of unifying the TV advertising ecosystem across all screens, inventory, and audiences. But addressable advertising really isn't new. I mean, a lot of MVPDs have been doing this for a couple years, but it's been up to this point limited to their 2 minutes of local inventory, and for the most part on VOD. So what we're talking about today is the enablement of programmers' national inventory, both VOD and linear, across a unified footprint. So no small undertaking. And I've got a panel of distinguished veterans in the industry. I'm Ed Knudson, by the way. I run product and strategy for Canoe Ventures. Let me introduce you to our panel. To my left here is Sid Gregory. He's the VP of Internal Services, also at Canoe, my office neighbor. Next to Sid is Steve Reynolds. He's the president of Imagine Communications. Oh, thank you. Next to Steve, then, to his left is Brad Danaher. He's the Director of TV Solutions at Experian. And then Garrett Niemeyer is the CTO at Ampersand, now formerly NCC Media. And then finally, Jason Manningham, General Manager at Blockgraph, which is a TV industry initiative at Comcast. So Sid, why don't you start us off, give us a kind of an overview of the ecosystem that's being contemplated right now for national linear.
Yeah, happy to do that. So let's get that up. There we go. So this is, as we said, we'll go back there. This is not new stuff. This is a variety of very complex systems, and I've tried to abstract a bit of it so that I can at least have a framework that we can put the discussion around. And it's generally from the flow of left to right, creating inventory opportunities and managing those for both linear and, as it happens, for VOD today that Canoe provides service assurance across. There's audience segmentation, processing to find out and discover who those particular ad variants ought to be most applicable to. There's the placement execution, which is really two components of making sure that when the set-top or player device receives signaling that there's a splicing event occurring or about to occur, that matched with some segmentation in a dynamic execution of finding out what the right ad copy is that should be provided to that player. And then finally, the most important component is really measurement and attribution. But I think from our perspective, the real mystery is not in the delivery of the signaling process, the execution, finding out what ad goes where, because we've done that historically on VOD for several years. But it's really, as we've invited our friends here, it's really understanding how we do this at scale and how the messaging between spots and slots on the traffic and billing systems in the linear component really get translated into dynamic campaign components on the components of campaign management that has occurred on the VOD platforms for years. So, the mystery there is there's a variety of specs available, all the way back to SCTE 104 and 224 that provide a lot of information about schedule, and a lot of information about the actual spot that's being fulfilled, all the way down to ESAM kinds of components that have historically driven signal conditioning components in the distribution system. So for us, the providing assurance across that, ensuring that ad copy entertainment is there, scheduling information is available, and that the opportunities are consistently marked between traffic and billing systems and dynamic campaign execution are really key factors in those areas.
Right. Yep.
So that's the backdrop that I wanted to provide for kind of all of us to take a look at.
Yeah, a lot of this it's obviously about scale, right? It's advertising, and so up to this point, media buyers have been kind of cobbling together individual buys to get something close to scale. But what we're contemplating here with this infrastructure is the idea of a buyer being able to place an addressable campaign and have it work seamlessly across the entire footprint, even though that footprint may consist of multiple MVPDs, multiple programmers, things like that, right?
Ease of use is the answer here.
Excellent. Yep. Thanks, Sid. We're going to leave this slide up because I think Steve wants to kind of talk a little bit about that too.
But there's a couple of interesting challenges that have to get resolved in order to really create this end-to-end ecosystem. I wanted to talk about two of them today. The first one is really how you define the inventory that's going to be available for this kind of a linear addressable environment. And that inventory goes all the way back to the programmer side, because they need to actually be able to put those avails into the system and make sure that everything is marked so that it can be sold, right? And I know some of the other panelists will talk about segmentation and attribution and how those things are going to work. But from our standpoint, what we're working on is creating these new multi-platform traffic systems, so that a programmer can actually define all of the inventory and all of the avails that they're going to make available across this entire ecosystem. That's going to cover linear, it's going to cover nonlinear, it's going to cover VOD, and addressability becomes a new layer in that ecosystem and the definition of where that inventory is going to be. What that's going to enable is a reaggregation of audience, right? I mean, what we've all seen over the course of the last couple of years is the audience getting fragmented and people moving to OTT platforms, people moving to on-demand. And as linear becomes more of an IP-delivered infrastructure, you're going to see that same fragmentation of audience, and it has to be reaggregated. You have to bring all of that audience back into one platform so that you can sell it as though it's a single audience. So that's a challenge. That's one of the things that we're working on right now within the traffic and inventory management systems. The other piece of what we're working on, though, is the signaling. Imagine builds, playout systems. We power a lot of the big networks and a lot of the cable networks. And we actually need to put the same kind of insertion infrastructure into place that's already been done for VOD. So one of the great things about what Canoe has done over the course of the last few years is actually figured out what that ecosystem looks like in terms of doing all of the SCTE injection and being able to handle those things downstream so that decisions can be made based on where the avails are and where the placements are within the streaming coming out. What we're working on now is making sure that all of that SCTE infrastructure, all of that 104 infrastructure, and the infrastructure that has to talk to the downstream systems, ESAM and things like that, we're putting all of that into the playout software so that the networks can actually do the generation of those SCTE triggers and have that go all the way through the system so that we know where the avails are and we can talk to the dynamic ad insertion systems even in linear. So not just for VOD, using all of that same triggering all the way through the system to make sure that decisions can be made dynamically on the linear inventory as well.
Yeah, linear is a much different animal than VOD, isn't it? I mean, it's, everybody, when they go to break and the ADSs start working on deciding who's going to see which ad, that gets to be a pretty big data problem, doesn't it?
It's a data problem, but it's also a scale problem. Right? When you think about all the decisions that have to be made and the timeliness with which those decisions need to be made, there is work that has to be done in terms of preconditioning and making sure that the ADSs and the ADRs properly scale up in order to handle the volume of linear traffic. And that really is going to be one of the technical challenges that we're all going to have to work on and solve together.
Yep.
Good. Thanks. Next, Brad, speaking, Steve touched a little bit on audience segments, and so maybe you could help us understand how audience segments are going to get created in this new environment and get populated throughout the infrastructure.
All right, happy to do it. So, Experian, I get a lot of looks. What's Experian doing here at this? There's no credit reports involved here. What's going on? But we actually have a wealth of information on the U.S. consumer and that's the data in the first part that helps inform folks, that drives the targeted advertising. So we're helping folks like Comcast, for instance, determine if they're trying to reach high-income households with kids. Well, we're the ones who know those households. So we're able to inform that and create those segments and give those to Comcast so they know which ads to serve. So that's the data part of what we do. Matching, we do a lot of very privacy compliant matching between partners. So again, using Comcast as an example, if Comcast wants to match other data sets as well to bring that into their data set, they look to us as that safe haven to match those in a privacy compliant way. So we do that for the industry, and actually both these things, we work with 100% of the linear addressable providers. So we have their data in-house. So whether it's matching or segmentation is needed, we can execute, and we can execute those buys that Ed talked about. If someone wants to do it across all of them, they can match with us and create one segmentation with us, and off it goes, and it's deployed through our partners. So, and that's kind of the activation. And obviously on the back end measurement, you need to know how it did, so we can help put that all together as well. So just quickly on matching, this is kind of a straightforward, simple document, but it's basically saying if say Allstate wants to match to Comcast, Allstate will send us either their name and address file or MAIDs or IP addresses, email addresses, whatever it is. We can match it to Comcast and make that connection so that, again, a targeted segment can be created. So it's a very kind of a key role in making it all happen. You need kind of that third party, neutral third party in the middle, and that would be us. So we'll keep. All right, so creating segments for addressability. So the advertiser or the agency usually determines, we're trying to reach, again, high-income households with at least 2 kids. They would tell us that. We would create that segment, find those households on the Comcast file. Then we tell Comcast how many households is that? Is that 1.1 million? Is that 2 million households? How much is that? From that, the buy, Comcast, the seller, can create and essentially tell Allstate, how much is that going to cost? So it's kind of a key part to know how big your size of the target is. So we work hand in hand with our partners to do that very quickly as well, because these need to be put together quickly. So once that's determined, we actually then flag those households on the Comcast file, send the file off to Comcast, so they recognize their file, they recognize their flags, and then they know who to deploy and serve the ads to. It's pretty seamless now. We helped actually Comcast do the first addressable household level trials in 2007. Mm-hmm. So we've been doing this a while, and it's much more seamless than it was even a few years ago. So that's the quick summary.
So how does the buyer at the front end, when we're getting ready to place their buy, they start selecting characteristics, right? Demographic characteristics, something that would make up an audience segment. You're saying that they'll be able to see what that audience size is in real time.
That's right.
Or within some short period of time.
Yes, exactly. We have a tool. They can go in and pick that segment, and then they'll say, here's how many Comcast households, here's how many, Charter households, Cox households, et cetera. Yep. Very quickly, allows them to quickly size, and sometimes they say, that's too big, it's just too wide, it's not targeted, and sometimes usually they make it a little too nichey at first.
Right.
Then they say, okay, we need to widen this up a little bit. So yes, it kind of quickly allows them to zero in on their target.
And when we're talking about the MVPD's subscriber base, they're really just hashed IDs, right? We're not, how do you separate out the personally identifiable information, which I know is important to all the MVPDs?
So what comes to us, it is name and address.
Yep.
So again, as we said, on the other side of our house, we take social security numbers in, right? So we're used to taking sensitive data, but yes, when it goes out, yes, it's all hashed. So if it was ever,
right. Okay.
The thinking is if it was ever intercepted, no one will know what that means.
Good.
So that's
okay.
correct.
Good. Thanks. Garrett, so what are some of the tools that will be at the front end that will enable buyers to see the new addressable audiences and enable campaigns with addressability?
So I think that the way that we sell this inventory may change a little bit, and so I want to maybe take a little bit of a different lens. So if you think about specifically national units, national spots, the national network will sell a unit, and they will sell them against a Nielsen broad audience definition, say adults 25 to 54. The spot runs the impression, and they basically get paid for all these impressions. If we're making this addressable, What we're allowing the advertisers to do is to take a much smaller specific segment out of that spot and to sell those impressions. So whereas before you had addressable, a spot would get hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of impressions that then get sold. Now all of a sudden we're making it much more narrow, and that's more valuable, but still, now all of a sudden we're talking about thousands or 10,000s of impressions. One of the things that advertisers like about TV is reach, so the massive unduplicated reach. You have instantaneous access to 1 million impressions. So if we go do these addressable technologies, we're shrinking that set of impressions. And so in order to get back to what's good about TV, you want to put it together, put a couple of these units together so that you're talking about a big audience again. So if you are a major network group and you own multiple networks, you can do that. You can run a couple of these different, you can put it together and you have reach again. And they can do that, they can sell that, and we should make the platform available for them to do that. If you're a smaller network or a mid-tier network, or you only have 1 or 2 networks to play with, we think there's another sort of way to do this, which is an aggregator or a platform that puts them together, sells on behalf of multiple networks, and monetizes the inventory that way, because it needs scale. So we think that's probably one thing that's going to happen. Another thing that I want to highlight is because you're selling very specific audience impressions, you won't get paid anymore for all these other impressions. So you better, if you take a unit and you make it addressable, you better know that the audience is going to be there. Otherwise, you wasted a lot of money. Yep. The only way you can do that is by looking at audience data, by looking at across your footprint who is watching what, and building predictive models on top of that that will tell you if you run that spot there, that audience is going to be there. Mm-hmm. So I think those are 2 relatively new things that you need in order for this to work.
Yeah. So I know some advertisers will buy the entire spot and then put multiple pieces of creative, right? Each piece of creative having a different message to a different audience. But as you mentioned, some advertisers or some programmers might sell it with multiple advertisers within the same break.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that...
Is there a limit to how many can be sold into?
It depends on the technology. Over satellite, you have less limitation. Over cable and telco, you need bandwidth, because satellite uses disk space, and telco and cable uses bandwidth. So there's some limitation there. Yeah, there's a limitation there. Yeah, but to your earlier point, some of us have been in this addressable space for quite a while, and yes, there is a use case where an advertiser buys the whole unit and splits it up. But by far the majority of advertisers want only buy the audience they are looking for, and they want to buy it against a custom segment.
Yeah.
So because all of us started with the idea you have 100 segments and everybody's going to buy those. Almost all advertisers show up with their own file. So American Express will show up with their own list of people that already have an American Express card, and that's the people that they want to target or whatever. So a lot of people will only want to buy their target audience against their first-party data file.
Got it. Thanks. So Jason, Blockgraph, as I understand it, is currently an incubator type product under, or whatever it is, under Freewheel.
Yeah.
And this can facilitate secure audience matching over peer-to-peer platform. Is that correct?
That's
I got that right?
Yeah, so if you think about addressable and what addressable requires, it requires collaboration across the entire ecosystem. MVPDs who have audience data, advertisers and agencies who have audience data, programmers who have content data and schedule data, and measurement companies, as well as data providers. And each of these parties has their own data set that effectively need to be joined together to really understand that audience across the entirety of the planning, targeting, measurement lifecycle. And because every party in the ecosystem has their own security concern, their own kind of requirements around how they want to use their data, we believe in order to build a sustainable, sound, and scalable foundation, it needed to be a platform-oriented approach that allowed companies to match data sets and work with their own first-party data, but also connect in with valuable third-party data and use that to do the segmentation, to build the actual plan, and then to ultimately measure the results. So block graph is kind of version 2.0 on some of the existing matching approaches, which uses the same techniques around encryption and matching, but does it over a secure private network that allows companies to match directly with their partners. So we're really excited about it and have been working towards building out this platform for the entirety of the ecosystem.
Got it. Okay. I'm going to ask the panel another question, but we're going to try to save a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience. If you have one, be thinking about it. So the question I have for you guys, maybe we can just kind of go down the line. What do you think is the biggest challenge right now to enabling national linear addressable television across a unified footprint?
Yeah. Oh, Sid.
You want to start, Sid?
Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Sid.
So I'll start. As Steve and I already know, it's not the technology. It's making sure people understand that there is an ease of access to it. But I will admit, I stay awake at night figuring out how we make this thing scale, right? Just from a performance perspective.
So I actually don't think the technology is going to be the problem. I'm not too worried about the scale. It turns out that guys like Amazon have solved scaling problems before. What I'm more concerned about is making sure that, especially at the buy-sell interface, there's a good way for the advertisers and for the agencies to actually look at this inventory and understand how they can get to the audience that they want. But solving that problem in a way that we're not going to undermine the value of the TV advertising ecosystem, right? I mean, part of the reason why TV is still such a great advertising model is because you have things like brand safety and you've got things like category separations and all of those things that need to be a part of the TV ecosystem in order to keep the CPMs high. What we don't want to do is turn television inventory into another kind of digital inventory.
Right.
And that's
Amen.
part of the danger here, right? So we need to make sure that there's a good way to describe what the inventory is, who the audience is, how you can segment that, how you can buy that, but do that in a way that it still protects the value of the CPM in the underlying video ad.
Good one. Yeah.
All right. I would say mine's kind of related to Steve's. I think the buy side needs to grasp this more. There's still, for all our talk, there's a lot of just, we're buying on age and gender, Nielsen age and gender, and there we go. And this is, there's a lot of secondary metric. This is a secondary metric, which is good, but once the buy side starts to really realize what they can do, that there is scale, that it's not that hard, the technology's in place, I think they'll start to adopt it, but you also need the brands to kind of ask for it.
Yep.
So I think it's less on the sell side and others more on the buy side.
Yeah. What about you, Garrick? What do you think of that?
I think there's a couple of things that are all solvable, but that are important. I agree totally that TV has some wonderful qualities, and we shouldn't throw them away and fragment things unnecessarily. That would be a tragic mistake. I think there is a scale issue only in the fact that it's going to combine a bunch of networks, satellite, cable that have slightly different characteristics, and so I think the main challenge though is going to be to make it look like it's one system. So that because no buyer is going to go and say, well, I buy this here, it works like this. It's just very complicated. We know that from cable already. This is why ampersand exists. Mm-hmm. So we need to do that also at a national level because otherwise it's just not going to work.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, I think to build on that, just driving simplicity of addressability for buyers, I think is one of the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities. There's a lot of complexity when it comes to all of the signaling that's necessary, the data layer that's necessary, and then the insertion and measurement. And I think it's really important for us to help simplify that process, and that's going to require a lot of coordination amongst a number of different players throughout the ecosystem. So I think coming together, setting the right standards and building on those standards, I think is a big challenge, but it's also a big opportunity for us.
Yep. Anybody want to take a stab at timing? When do you think this will happen? Who's bold enough to make a prediction?
Well, it is happening.
It is happening, true, but
so
on a national, unified basis.
Yes, it's estimated it's going to be 7% of total ad spend next year. So it's come a long way in terms of, it still is like 4.7 billion, I think, is the number. So it's coming, but.
And there are some good models around the world, right? I mean, the U.S. market is actually one of the markets that's going to move the last towards audience-based buying and move towards addressability. I mean, we do a lot of work with Sky over in the UK, for example, and they've had that AdSmart platform in the market for 10 years now. Yeah. So they've been selling targeted, addressable advertising on an audience basis for 10 years. So, you know, what we all need to do is take a look at the things that are working outside of the US, see which pieces of that model make sense for us, and figure out where we want to try to improve on that. But there are definitely some models that we can look at to try to figure out how to get this business to a point of scale.
Got it. Good. Anybody, any questions from the audience for our panelists? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller?
Come on now.
Up, there's one.
Hey.
Thanks. Fred Dawson, Screenplays. What's missing in the discussion, from my ignorance level at least, is in this whole buy-sell arrangement, are we talking about maintaining upfront buying as, in other words, they're buying this stuff based on all these definitions and what you all have come up with in terms of everything you've been discussing, and they know what they're buying in advance, much like they buy now? Or is this more like a bidding process with programmatic? And that's what I need to clarify.
I don't see why it wouldn't. I'm not sure that a bidding process like with programmatic would be good for TV, because you're, as Steve said, TV is a unique product. It's a mass reach product. So you don't want to fragment it up impression by impression and destroy it. So I don't see why you couldn't have this capability and still sell it with upfronts and spot market, just the way TV is sold today. It's just better and more precise and more data driven, and you can do attribution. So yeah, I don't think it has to be a real-time bidding type of situation at all.
Good question.
Agree.
Anybody else? Yes, there's.
This is arguably the naive question of your conference, but I need to understand this. Are you guys talking about flying in different dynamic pieces of commercial copy within the same linear ad break, USA Network 7:30 7 p.m., or is everyone in the nation seeing the same commercial, but you're simply applying different data sets to determine who's counting as the audience for that?
I think it's, I'll take a stab and you guys can add. You know, I think initially there will be advertisers who still buy the entire break. So Ford, for example, may buy the break, but they may deliver 3 or 4 different pieces of creative, each you know, maybe one emphasizing the truck, one emphasizing the van, and those will be targeted to those audiences that are most receptive to those products. Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah,
right.
I think there's a broader advanced TV umbrella where you think about optimizing a schedule based on an audience. That's more on the planning side, but then addressability is really around actually serving the creative to different households. And then there's the measurement side of the equation, which is understanding which households actually drove the results that you wanted them to based on the audience you were trying to hit. So I think it's part of the broader advanced TV umbrella, but addressable is primarily targeting a given kind of set of households based on an audience.
Yeah, and you mentioned measurement,
yeah,
I think.
And I would say they are doing split avails as well.
Right.
Yep.
So totally different advertisers in the same time, different ads, yes.
Yeah.
That's much more complex. The pricing algorithms to determine what how you price that is makes it much more complex, much easier, as you say, to sell it to Ford, and they just bought the whole spot and you're just divvying up the creative. That's simpler.
But because it is data driven, I think, you know, the measurement will become far more precise than what we're used to in television today.
But I think where things eventually evolve to is that they don't buy the spot anymore. Right? They buy the audience.
Right.
So the advertiser defines the audience that they want to buy based on the criteria that are available, based on the segmentation that's available, and they buy that audience. And the systems that we're putting in place will then make the decisions about how to fulfill that audience within the break structure that's defined.
Yep.
Yeah.
I use this example around the office all the time. I think I'll know it's working when I'm watching The Voice with my wife, for example, and an ad for the new Callaway driver comes on. while I'm watching The Voice. You know, you wouldn't expect to see that, but if they know that there's an avid golfer in the household, they may be willing to pay more for that spot, knowing that I'm watching TV at that time. So,
Yep.
any other comments, questions? All right, panelists, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. It's very, very informative. Thanks, everybody.